It is my pleasure this morning to welcome Rita Nakashima-Brack to our pulpit here to read scripture. And before she does, I want to take a moment to recognize her. It's a sad moment in that we are bidding farewell to Rita. As you may know, for almost a year now, Rita's been commuting to Fort Worth, Texas for her work. I think that would drive anybody nuts. At Bright University, she has co-founded the Soul Repair Center to educate the public about recovery from moral injury, especially combat veterans. This permanent move has been a long time coming, although Rita specifically tried to avoid moving from her beloved Oakland and the Bay Area. And I'm a bit concerned, since her favorite activity, she tells me, is downhill skiing. But she has assured me that the Cowgirl Museum in Fort Worth, the only of its kind in the world, is a favorite way to spend time because it's really the history of badass Western women. This one that we know, who has been a justice-making leader most of her life, just may come back to visit in her cowgirl regalia. Rita says that a donor to the center agreed to endow her position if she moved there and worked full-time, which in the end will keep her sane and support the center's success. So I think we support this move wholeheartedly. So Rita, you will be missed, but we know we will hear and read about the impact that your work is having and that you will be back to visit for sure. So Godspeed. And I invite all of you to take time to visit with Rita during the coffee hour afterwards and to bid her farewell personally.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you for not saying some of the things I shared. Several of you have asked about my eyes, and I'm just getting over viral infection. And the good news for me is that it doesn't hurt at all, but the bad news for you is I don't have to look at it. Our reading today, the first reading, is from Acts 9, verses 36 to 43. And I want to contextualize this story a bit, so as I'm reading, your mind doesn't wander off into trying to figure out the science of this story. Because it's about a resurrection of raising from the dead by Peter, and it's in a series of stories about Saul and Peter. The context of it's easy to sort of personalize these stories as adventures of interesting characters in the Bible, but most of the time when we're listening to a story, it's important to know that this was a prized story, and it's in here for a reason. It's not just a funny little detail or a lovely story to think about, but it's telling us something about the birth of the church and what the church, in its arising from the ashes of a crucifixion, what it's struggling with as it's continuing to try to build this amazing justice movement that was following Jesus. And the characters in this story are a woman named Tabitha, and there are interesting historical little details in the text, like they tell you what her name in Greek is, which is a signal about something happening in this Jewish movement in relation to the Gentiles that just had happened to Saul. Just before this story occurs, Saul, who had been persecuting the Christians as a renegade Jewish sect, repents and is converted. So Saul has become Paul just before this text happens, this story happens, and Peter is still in his narrow-minded Judaism when this story occurs. He has not yet been converted. And so the story of Tabitha suggests that with her Roman and Greek names, there's something going on about this dual identity that's being presented in Tabitha. Another important detail, and these are not individuals, but they're really stand-ins for a whole community. So Tabitha is a stand-in for the women in the community, and because she dies, the people traditionally who took care of the dead and led the grieving rituals for the whole community were women, especially widows who were very acquainted with grief. And so when the text says they sent two men, they did this, that we're talking about the grieving body of women whom Tabitha was a leader for, and so she's also a kind of stand-in for the fate of that community of women. So I think it's important to keep those kinds of things in mind when you hear this story. We're not just talking about individuals, we're talking about what is happening in the community here. So, now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was near Joppa and that was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. Thus ends the reading of this word.